Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international security questions with our special guests on the Bugajski hot seat, Majda Ruge, Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, Johns Hopkins University in Washington, and a Senior Fellow with the European Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin, Germany. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Balkan Great Game. The Great Game, a 19th century confrontation between the British and Russian empires in Central Asia, is often invoked as a prime example of the struggle for influence between major powers. But another great game was played out in the Balkans between Russia and European powers when the Ottoman Empire retreated. We are now witnessing the 21st century version of the Balkan Great Game, but where Moscow relies on subversion and deception as it cannot compete militarily or economically with the West. Putin's Russia does not simply meddle on the Balkan Peninsula. This term disguises Moscow's long-term objectives and may weaken the urgency of a concerted Western response. The Kremlin views the Balkans as a strategic asset and pursues at least four consistent goals. First, it seeks to expand Russia's geopolitical reach. The Balkans are a stepping stone to the Adriatic and Mediterranean, a link between Europe and Asia, and an inroad into Central Europe. Moscow's influence over Balkan governments, its role in multinational formats, and its institutional presence through various arms of the Russian state provide it with a major stake in the region's evolution. A second and related goal is to fracture Western cohesion and undermine the role of Western institutions. Fomenting conflict not only contributes to unsettling the Balkans, it also divides international responses. One recent example was the territorial exchange gamble between Serbia and Kosovo, supported by Moscow and accepted by some Western officials. Even debates about partition promote rifts in the region and policy disarray between Western governments. Unresolved conflicts and disputed states also enable the Kremlin to claim that despite its expansion, NATO has failed to stabilize the Balkans. A third objective is to undercut the US presence. The main reason for obstructing NATO enlargement is to prevent a growing American military footprint and to preclude any security guarantees to countries in the region. The Kremlin prefers that Balkan states not join the alliance. Nonetheless, it also intensifies efforts to weaken the EU and NATO from within, as its growing influences in Croatia, Hungary and Bulgaria demonstrate. A fourth goal is to gain allies as supplicants. This is where the economic and energy dimensions are most pronounced in blackmailing, bribing or subordinating officials and politicians who can assist Moscow by weakening sanctions or urging a return to normal business. Simultaneously, state-directed disinformation campaigns claim that Western democracies are a failing system, that the EU will disintegrate, and that close ties with Russia offer a viable alternative. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Majda Ruge, Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, Johns Hopkins University here in Washington, and also Senior Fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, Germany. Majda, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You live in Germany, but you work on both sides of the Atlantic. Can you therefore tell us a little bit about the European Council on Foreign Relations? We don't have many European guests on my show here in Washington. We do in Pristina, but not in Washington. So what is the mission, what is the role of the Council?
The European Council on Foreign Relations, or ECFR shortened, is actually a pan-European think tank with offices in 7 European capitals in London, Madrid, Paris, Berlin, Sofia, Warsaw, and Rome. And so it has a truly pan-European perspective on research and analysis, on convening and policy advocacy. The they really produce cutting-edge research and analysis on European foreign policy, mostly in relation to European power and actorness, if you want, in relation to Middle East and North Africa, wider Europe, which includes Western Balkans, Asia, etc. So it's an excellent institution to help European Union regain its capabilities.
Absolutely. Well, we met a few months ago when we testified together in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, particularly on the Balkans, on Bosnia and Kosovo and so forth. You do similar work, I presume, vis-a-vis the German government or EU Parliament in terms of testifying, giving them reports and so forth?
Well, in that sort of form, as an expert witness in the Parliament, not yet. But you know, ECFR as an institution does a lot of convening and policy advocacy with Brussels and with the German government. Right.
And you issue quite regular reports. I know a few people that are actually on the council, very good people. Let's turn now, Majda, to US-EU foreign policy. And we discussed it before that there are really two parts of it. There's the bilateral ties between the US and the EU, which is the first question, and the other is, of course, common or not so common foreign and security policies towards other areas, which would include Southeast Europe. So let's start with the former. How do you view US-EU relations? How have they developed under the Donald Trump administration? How does it differ from the Obama years?
Okay. Short answer is, obviously, they're under strain. But longer answer would actually first start with putting it in a bit of a historical context and starting with American interests in this regard. And if you look from 1945 until Obama administration, a very consistent policy of consecutive U.S. administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, on Europe, has been that Europe should not be dominated by any outside power, that it should be politically united and cohesive and prosperous and have strong democratic institutions. And most of the policies, including the ones that you're very familiar with, the NATO enlargement to Baltics, the EU enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, as well as reunification of Germany, were supported by the US for precisely this purpose. And I think before we start describing what's happening, we need to put it in the context and ask why. Why is this still relevant in 2020? Because it does remain relevant in 2020, and we need to understand why. And so if you just look at the transatlantic partnership in economic terms, right? The EU and US together account jointly for half of the global GDP. Their trade is about 30 or 40% of global goods and services. And they're basically each other's main bilateral partners and investors. I think US invests 3 times more in the EU than in the whole of Asia altogether. So it's really a relationship on the basis of which both American and European prosperity and kind of standing on the world stage depends. So now going to the question, well, how has it developed? And there we can look at 2 levels. One is the US direct policy towards the EU and its response. And there, obviously, it has taken an unprecedented turn, even continuing somewhat Obama's political and diplomatic disengagement. It did go into the direction of unprecedented conflictual discourse towards the idea of the EU in general of President Trump. The notion that EU was created as a competitor, economic competitor, and Germany takes the lead there, obviously, in that discourse. But then the mercantilist view of this economic relationship and the, perhaps upcoming trade war. We already had tariffs that were imposed on aluminum and steel of all of the European countries. And then we had, from the EU, the response of the reciprocal tariffs on the US goods. So it's clearly under strain. The good news is, I think in terms of military deployment, I think that's very often forgotten when we go into this alarmist description of what's going on, is that there has actually, under the European Deterrence Initiative that you're very familiar with, there has in fact been steadily increase of deployment, both of troops and funds on the eastern flank. So we have some good news, and then we do have a strain, and especially on the economic side.
Let me jump in. Presumably the Europeans realize that in a way we have a dual foreign policy. In other words, what Trump says and does, sometimes his things come across, sometimes he's able to implement, sometimes he's ignored. In other words, foreign policy goes on regardless of his views of the European Union. Members of the administration actually have praised the European Union, have valued its importance, particularly in areas such as the Balkans, on the Eastern Front and so forth. So is that noted? In other words, not everything is bad.
Depends by whom, right? I think the embassies, if you look at the governments and the embassies, they certainly note that. And I think you have, in kind of observing what's going on, you certainly have different, and you always do, discourse and response from the diplomats and the embassies and then from the commentators. And just to pick up on what you've said, it's really interesting. I mean, talking about European response to Donald Trump's administration, it has also been to increase its engagement with governors and individual states, depending on what issue we're talking about. So kind of going back to the second, if you want, level of relations that are not directly affecting the EU, but that are affecting, you know, indirectly European security, such as JCPOA, such as Libya policy, such as withdrawal from Syria and Middle East, North Africa altogether. And climate, importantly, Paris Climate Accord. So, you know, what have the Europeans done? Well, they've engaged on climate, for instance. They've engaged with governors that are, you know, very, very aware of the climate risks and global kind of security risks that impose. So you had at the Bonn Climate Summit, I think it was in 2018 or maybe 19, you had 4 governors of individual states, California being the lead one. And the embassies have engaged very much with Congress, both with Senate and the House, trying to kind of forge this bipartisan consensus on, you know, commitment to the transatlantic relationship. So at the Munich Security Conference, you had 50, the last one you had 50 senators and members of House, and that was an unprecedented presence. So yes, there's definitely kind of a dual.
Yeah, and to follow up, Trump himself has been very outspoken on the European Union. He openly supported Brexit. He openly supports other countries leaving if there is a referendum and they feel they must. And yet there are members of the administration who understand the value of trying to keep that union together, how it's a partner for the United States. So,
absolutely.
But so how is his approach towards the future of the European Union interpreted by European Union leaders? Is it that considered to be a transient event? Is it should be ignored? You know, how is it received?
It's a great question. If you look at Merkel just gave an interview to Financial Times about 2 weeks ago, and it was actually the kind of goodbye interview for the departing FT editor. And she was asked precisely this question. So they asked her, is this a structural or a personal? And so is it a personality issue? Should we kind of just sit out Trump and wait for a next president? Or is it a structural issue? And her answer was, it's structural. I mean, obviously, she's not going to right now say anything else. But, you know, what she then did follow up to say is, we have to be aware, certainly personality plays a great role in terms of how the discourse is shaped. But on, you know, the American kind of disengagement from Europe and kind of pivoting to Asia has already started under Obama. And Merkel says then it's not going to change with the new president. So Europe needs to, you know, think about that and regain some of its strategic kind of capability to act. But you know, I do think that what is going to change, and I think everyone is aware of that, is the hostile, and let's hope so, hostile discourse towards the European Union in general. And I think why, you know, if you talk about Congress, why there's an understanding of the importance of the European cohesion and European unity is that that is really the only way that you are going to have Europe defend itself against, you know, dominance, say, by China, right? China is increasingly becoming the organizing principle for foreign policy in the US. The Europeans are having a very, very lively debate right now about the role of China. And so Brexit, the best case in point, I think it was last week or 10 days ago, the Brits have allowed its 5G network to be parts of it to be
despite opposition from Washington.
Despite opposition from Washington, to be supplied by Huawei.
Right.
And I think that is, and one of the reasons is because of its weak point at this moment being outside of the EU. So
you raise a very important point about the future of the European Union. There's a lot of feeling in Washington that Europe punches below its weight. In other words, being a major economic superpower with the resources and capabilities and reach that it has, it doesn't have enough of a drive, enough of momentum in its foreign policy, enough cohesion, let's say, in its foreign policy. Is that going to change? Presumably that's what America was talking about.
yeah, I mean, we knew that for a long time, right? In 1993, Chris Hill wrote this legendary article called on European foreign policy called The Gap Between Expectations and Capabilities.
I'm not even talking about the military side. I'm talking about all the other factors.
Even political.
Yeah.
And I guess, I mean, try go and convince your 28 or 27 relatives, all with different kind of preferences and interests and histories, to agree on a very simple thing. It's not easy. So by definition, European Union, is not as fast, quick, and decisive simply because it has such decision-making mechanisms. I mean, if you look on, and it really depends on areas, whether you're talking about policy areas where the European Union has exclusive competence, so that the Commission is able to act, or whether you're talking about the area where basically member states maintain their intergovernmental competence and pursue their interests. So if you look at how Europe has responded on trade, in this initial kind of spat on steel and aluminum, is Commission had a mandate and was able to act quickly and reimpose tariffs. Whether there's going to have a good outcome or not is a different question, but it was able to act. The Europeans held together on JCPOA very well. They held together on Brexit very well. Where they're not good at is obviously...
JCPOA, by the way, is the Iran, let's say...
Joint Comprehensive Agreement
nuclear
on
deal,
the Iran nuclear deal. So I think it really, is kind of a little bit premature to expect that Europe is suddenly going to change. However, what is happening now between Macron and Merkel especially is the debate in Europe on how we can move Europe forward to be a little bit more capable of greater political cohesion and dealing with the conflicts in its neighborhood that Americans are no longer interested with, Libya being the best case in point. And so in that sense, I think thinking in future, you really have to kind of, it is a bit of a, not really Merkel's, but Macron's, if you want, area. He's the one who was very enthusiastic upon, after the election. He was very enthusiastic because he saw his term in office and Merkel's term in office perfectly synchronized. They had almost a term together, and she did not, because of the coalition in Germany, kind of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats canceling each other out on many of these Macron's initiatives. She did not take the lead. And so, there is lots of discussion on that right now. How it's going to develop will really depend on what...
Well, how do you see, the bigger question, bigger picture, how do you see the future of the European Union after Brexit? Brexit is now a done deal.
Right.
It's going to, obviously, they're going to take a long time to negotiate trade and other arrangements between London and Brussels and the other capitals. But where does that leave the European Union? Do you see this as an impetus for other countries potentially leaving, West European countries? Do you see, I know at the last elections, populism in a way was countered by some other movements, at least in the elections for the European Parliament. Do you see nationalism continuing to rise, populism resurfacing, Britain as a model? How do you see the European Union?
So there's two questions here, right? One is what's the European Union left with after Brexit? The other one is nationalism, populism, which I think are somewhat separate questions. A short answer on UK and EU. So we have an EU impoverished by one member that was quite active on foreign policy issues and very, very constructive, big contributor and very constructive, especially in the Western Balkans. I mean, if you look at Ashdown's time in Bosnia, UK, US, EU, Quint together played a major role. as far as whether other countries will look to leave, I actually think, having seen what happened through Brexit and impact on UK, in fact, no. I think maybe it might even
cold
have
shower.
Yeah, it is a cold shower.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, so what is, what's UK left with after Brexit? Also, short answer is diminished leverage, diminished power, right? Especially in economic terms, it has to renegotiate the trade agreement. With the WTO membership, the relationship with the EU, the trade agreement with the US, 5G decision just shows you how much it has diminished in leverage vis-a-vis China. But it will still continue to have a say in foreign and security policy because it happens to be on the UN Security Council, because it happens to be the nuclear power, etc. On nationalism and populism, I think political commentators these days tend to put them all, far-right, populism, nationalism, tend to put them all in a single basket. But there's significant, it doesn't have, these terms do not have to be identical. Sure. If you take Scottish Nationalist Party, for instance, Scottish Nationalist Party and their agenda for devolution or independence has developed based on a very distinct sense of, on a sense of a very distinct political culture and political identity, right? So, if you look at what is Scottish kind of, if you want, attempt, to have greater autonomy or nation, it is based on pro-European agenda. So they're actually,
Sure.
if they go for a referendum on independence, is because they want to stay in Europe.
And Donald Tusk recently said they would be welcome. I'm not sure how widespread that feeling is in Europe. Presumably they would agree.
I mean, if you look at the tweets of the Scottish MPs and the Prime Minister at the eve of Brexit, they said, goodbye, Europe, we'll be back, right? They're, if you want, their national identity is also based on a completely different sense of education policy, social policy. They're very inclusive of immigrants and minorities. So that is a very different phenomena from far-right movements, which include AfD, FPÖ, Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs, Salvini's Liga, etc., etc. Jobbik and Fidesz in Hungary.
And one could say the same with the Catalonian movement. Catalonia does not want to leave the European Union. They simply want to be a separate state within the European Union.
Right. So the discourse is very different.
Right.
And I would say if you take the Scottish, I mean, especially the Scots, they have a concept, they have a platform, they have an agenda, they know what they want. They're not exclusive, they're not xenophobic. On the other hand, you have parties like AfD, which now has 12.8%, I think, in the German parliament, which is, after CDU, in the last election, after CDU and SPD was the third party, now it overtook
That's the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, right?
And their agenda is simply, feeding on the fear of immigration.
This is the alternative for Germany you're talking about.
Exactly, alternative for Germany. Really very Eurosceptic, very anti-EU, anti-Euro, also skeptic on climate change without really any constructive agenda to put forward.
And particularly strong in the former communist GDR.
Yes, but also after 2015, if you look at how their supporters have grown, their kind of followers in West Germany have also increased.
Well, this takes us very nicely onto something that you've been working on, which is public opinion, German public opinion.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work on that? In other words, well, my audience would be particularly interested in German public opinion on the Balkans, on the Albanian world, on Kosovo, on migration, and so on and so forth. So
just to clarify, the work on German public opinion is not mine. I follow it, and it's done regularly by a fantastic foundation in Berlin called Körber Stiftung or Körber Foundation, and they have something that is called Berlin Pulse, which is kind of a regular, very, very detailed polling of German public opinion on foreign policy issues. And there, what you see is over years how German perspective on the U.S. and the relationship with the U.S. changes, but also various positions on foreign policy issues and on German foreign policy, such as the question, should Germany get more engaged, and if so, in which, should it take more of a leadership role, and in which areas?
Right.
And so there's just some interesting figures, especially concerning the relationship with the US, where 73% of Germans see the relationship with the US as bad or very bad, and only 2% of Germans see the relationship with the US in a positive way. And that is very much cyclical and connected to which president is in office.
Sure.
But on the Western Balkans, to be honest, I haven't looked at the polls, so I couldn't give you any figures. What I think is really, and how much German, there's so many different issues that the German citizens are concerned with these days, that Balkans is, I would say, not that high on the radar. But if you look at German position, the government and the coalition,
Right.
and the debate in the Bundestag on the Western Balkans, there is obviously a sense that there's no alternative to membership
For each country.
Yeah. And but now we're specifically speaking about opening of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia.
Right.
And the Germans have so far been quite insistent that yes, there's tons of ifs and tons of conditions that have been attached to opening accession negotiations with Albania. But similarly to the Italians, they want to keep these two together rather than decouple them. Whereas you have, Dutch especially,
Right.
but also some other member states who
Danish,
are
I
saying
think, as well. Yeah.
you have to decouple, otherwise we're not going to say yes.
Yeah.
So I think this is the point of contention. Last bit on Germany and the Western Balkans, emigration.
Yes, this is a very important issue, yeah.
And I think that has kind of gone under the radar of so many, not so much analysts, but I think it hasn't really reached the level of relevance not on the foreign policy agenda as it should. Germany, on the 1st of March, is going to introduce a new regulation on employment and the labor market in terms of foreign nationals coming and seeking employment in Germany. And where it differs from what was in force before is that it now allows for university graduate and highly skilled educated workers worldwide, this is not just for Western Balkans, but worldwide, to come to Germany without a working permit, apply and seek employment there, without having, previously there was a requirement that you have to prove that there's no German or citizen of the European Union who is capable or willing to do the job. Now that has been taken away. So it has and then apply for the working permit and resident permits. So it has become, from the 1st of March, it is going to become much easier for nationals from all around the world, but Western Balkans in particular, to come to Germany without employment, look for a job. German labor market is unsupplied in many sectors, and the predicted impact on the region is significant. I mean, if you look at the figures, I think it was yesterday I was reading in Financial Times that the estimate is that about 400,000 people have left the region in the last 5 years.
Right.
But World Bank has come out with the figure that only in Bosnia, 180,000 people have left in 1 year, which is really alarming. And the point is, it's not just that you're losing skilled workers for your economy, right? But you're really using the most, if you want, politically aware voting constituency.
Politically active, socially active, and so forth.
Politically active, socially active. So Heinrich Böll Foundation has done a poll among those planning to emigrate on do you vote, are you registered to vote, and how often do you vote? And basically around, I think 80% of those leaving were active registered voters. Right? So it is really undermining not just the economic aspect, but it's undermining all other.
So it's good for Germany, but it's bad for the region.
Very bad for the region and democracy in the region.
How would this affect Kosovo, which still does not have the visa liberalization with the European Union? How would that affect?
They'll have to, I mean, I don't think it affects them that much, except that they can't just arrive without a visa. They have to apply for a visa. In Pristina, and once in Germany, seek employment. So I think there will be one step. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on this, because I'm not sure whether how easy or difficult it will be to get a visa to travel. But since this regulation is worldwide, it applies to many countries that have a visa regime with Germany. So I think citizens traveling will simply have to apply for a visa.
So there's nothing going back to these countries in return, because remember, the state and taxpayers invested in their education.
Yeah.
And yet Germany is going to benefit from that education.
Yeah, the price tag is quite significant. And I think we're starting now a conversation in Germany. What do you do about it? There is a price tag attached to that. And I think that, there is definitely a lot of thinking being put at how do you mitigate, because I think Germany acting in its self-interest is not going to say, so we're going to change this regulation.
Right.
But you do have to see how do you mitigate and how do you invest in educated people and providing some incentives to stay. I mean, German investors, German companies have a big interest, who invest in the region, have a big interest in having skilled workers there as well. So there's kind of different coalitions of interest there. Let's
turn again to the bigger picture. And you mentioned earlier that Germany, Bundestag, and the government is very much for including all the West Balkan states. But Macron, and as you mentioned a few others, the Dutch and Danes, a few others, hesitant. Macron himself squelched the progress of North Macedonia and Albania towards accession talks. And now there is more discussion about the future of enlargement. How do you see the future of enlargement?
We'll know very soon. I mean, we have tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow that Commission is scheduled to come out with its proposal on reforming the kind of accession process. The French, I think, honestly, I think Macron's decision last year had as much to do with his frustration with, Germany and Merkel on many, issues unrelated to Western Balkans. As it had to do with concerns that were spelled out, right? So Macron said the EU is not working from within, the enlargement process is not working, we need to reform it before we can go ahead. And I think he didn't expect the backlash that he got on this one. So my sense is, I mean, there's kind of three important dates that we need to look at. The first one is Commission coming out this week, I think it might be tomorrow, with its proposal on how the accession process should be reformed. This proposal should address French concerns. Then we have, in late March, we have the meetings of the General Affairs Council and the European Council, where the decision should be made, right? Two decisions, in fact. First one on methodology for enlargement, and the second one on opening up the accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania. And the timing is critical because it happens at the end of March, and we have elections in North Macedonia on April 12th.
Exactly. Majda, one of the things that we discussed in the Senate, I remember, is this conflict resolution question. The remaining, the outstanding, I suppose you call them frozen, but unresolved conflicts or unresolved, let's say, paralysis in the region. We talked about Bosnia, we talked about Kosovo, Serbia. Let's consider for a few minutes the lessons of Dayton Accords that you studied in some detail. What have we learned? What have we forgotten about Dayton and its importance in conflict resolution?
Well, first of all, great that you bring that up, because this year is 25th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Agreement, which is a quarter of a century.
It's quite a time.
Makes one feel old. So what are the lessons? I think the lessons, are very general ones, if we talk about power sharing agreements, to me, is that if you place a power sharing agreement like Dayton, right, which was in fact taken from Leipert's idea of power sharing, theoretically developed on the models completely different from Bosnia, right? So the Dutch and the Swiss, where the elites are committed to common state and are committed to, in fact, making lives of their citizens better, but having some representation. But if you place this sort of a power sharing agreement in the context of conflict that had a very strong criminal dimension, right? Which is, what Bosnian conflict was like, where you had a very strong network of ethnic politicians in bed with, all sorts of different networks of clandestine fighters, smuggling networks, etc. And you give them a power-sharing formula. I mean, what you really do is you cement the illiberal, I wouldn't even call it democracy, but you cement, it's a recipe for cementing state capture. Because you provide them with mechanisms that are supposed to safeguard the ethnic or national interests that are then used to, in fact, shield themselves from accountability and to continue to plunder state resources.
It's almost like saying, if you stop shooting, your neighbor will give you whatever you want in the economy and political structure.
Yeah.
Which is, so it's sort of quid pro quo in a way.
Right, but I think it's important to, when we think about Dayton Peace Agreement, I mean, I have some figures here on, what it really means in terms of government expenditures, right? So you have in 2018 government expenditures in Bosnia at 40.6% of GDP. And 25% of that goes on salaries in the administration. And less than 9% goes for investment. So think about what it just does to country in terms of its capacity to develop its economy and stop the brain drain that has now brought Bosnia down to 2.7 million people. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is really, maybe to mention one positive aspect is that because you have a division, it's a very tiny positive one, and that is that you might get actors who can carve out some space at the local level for action. And we had that recently in Bosnia with Sarajevo Canton, where we basically had a coalition, an unlikely coalition of parties, but led by one party that was very clear on wanting to introduce transparency standards and accountability in government, implementing audits of public companies, really doing something quite revolutionary for Bosnia. They didn't survive. So I guess the general lessons is it's crippling the country.
Well, back to international involvement in the region. The US has recently launched a new policy of appointing, again, special envoys.
Yes.
Something that we had in the 90s, something we had in Bosnia, we had in Macedonia. What is your sense about these roles? Can they recreate the trust, the confidence, the effectiveness of people like Paddy Ashdown and Pardew and Holbrooke?
It's a different task so if we think about, we now have two envoys, two US envoys.
Right.
We were, all of the commentators were, wishing one, and then they got two. And their task currently, I think, is very different from, for instance, what Holbrooke had to do. Holbrooke had to stop the war, right? So it was a completely different sort of a task.
Right.
But we could compare to what Paddy had to do.
Paddy Ashdown in Bosnia.
Paddy Ashdown, the High Representative in Bosnia, who was appointed as a High Representative, but he was also appointed as the EU Special Representative. So he had two hats. He had a kind of a hat of bond powers, imposing, sacking, etc. But he also had a hat of the EU, which was kind of speaking about EU membership, and that gave him the legitimacy.
So it was a carrot and a stick in a way.
So he had both, and he was a brilliant strategist. I mean, he was a Royal Marine, turned politician, member of the House of Lords, extremely well connected politically, and so he knew, how to use his mandate and mobilize the political support that was necessary, and that included U.S. during the George W. Bush administration with Colin Powell as Foreign Secretary, and that included UK, Germany, and the other members of Quint, Italy, France, and Brussels. And so what Ashdown, I mean, some of the success in Bosnia can be really attributed to his ability to create, to make everyone pull in the same direction. The capitals, but also all the resources on the ground, including UFOR troops, right? Including the financial institutions, treasury for audits, etc. What you have right now is you have two special reps with a different sort of political leverage, one a career diplomat, one very politically connected to the White House, but they're acting at the time where you have increasingly little unity and little cohesion among these key actors that Paddy had back him up politically. So I guess my first question would be, will, for instance, Richard Grenell be able to achieve anything if he's unable to build this coalition between the US, Germany, UK, Brussels, etc.? And at the moment, it doesn't look like, there are some efforts to mobilize all the actors together, but it really looks like,
well, he
a bit of an independent...
Right, exactly. He recently stated these two agreements on rail and air services between Belgrade and Pristina. I don't think this was done with EU participation of Berlin.
Yeah, it seemed like a very...
a sort of one-off type.
One-off.
Yeah. But the question, two questions I have though. One, he did say though that he's open to the European Union joining in efforts, which indicates to me that there may be some reluctance on the European Union side, or maybe reluctance on the American side. I'm not sure which. And secondly, it's all very well to have a rail connection and an air connection, but that doesn't resolve the key problems. Are we again reaching for the, as we call it, the low-hanging fruit, rather than going for the core of the problem, which is the lack of Serbian recognition of Kosovo as a state?
Yeah. I mean, it would be great to have direct flights and the trains, as long as they're not painted in provocative...
And Serbia and Kosovo's control over its own airspace as well, yeah.
So, to be honest, the first question is, will any of this materialize? Even if we say it's low-hanging fruit, we actually need much more substantive approach. Even, we can acknowledge, great. It would be great to have a direct flight between the two capitals. But honestly, and I think this is why the Europeans have been very quiet on that, there has been huge criticism, again, by the community of political commentators. Where is the EU? US is, again, taking the lead. But honestly, I think what Europeans have done is, they've been somewhat taken by surprise. And then, they're saying, this is not a done deal. This is a letter of intent that has then been conditioned by many, many ifs. Coming from the Serbian side, which we're not sure whether they're going to materialize. So let's wait and see what happens with both the flight and the rail service. I'd be very glad to see it work out, but I'm not sure that it's going to be that easy.
Exactly. Majda, because we're running out of time, let me ask you one last question, which is, I suppose, a very important question for Kosovo. They have a government. We have a government in Pristina, finally, after 4 months. It's a new government, new parties in. They've made various promises. They're pledging jobs and justice is the focus of this administration. How do you see? I mean, obviously, you're waiting to see the elections in Serbia in April. The government that comes in there. Only then, I think, real negotiations or real talks will begin. How do you see? What is that this government needs to achieve? What would you say are the priorities in Pristina?
Well, if you look at, I mean, it would be good. I could throw that question back to you, because you had Albin Kurti here as a guest twice, at least, if not more.
In Pristina, yeah.
Oh, I thought it was filmed.
No, it was in Pristina.
It was in Pristina. I think if you look at short answer to what will be priorities of the government, if you look at the ministry, that Vete Vendosia has taken, it's all the ministries that deal with the socioeconomic issues, right? So it's Ministry of Health, it's Ministry of Economy, it's Ministry of Justice, then it's Foreign Affairs, and one more, I forget. No, they have 6. So I think it's very indicative of Vete Vendosia's agenda that has been over and over repeated during the 23 years in opposition, and that is focus on the rule of law, focus on anti-corruption, focus on developing the economy, with a bit of a different model, I think, than the Americans or Western Europeans are used to. It's probably not going to be as kind of center-right market model. And Kurti has spelled this out in your interviews.
Sure.
So I think And I think that's correct way to go about it. I mean, if we go back to the figures of population leaving, Kosovo has below 2 million people. I think your priority should really be to capitalize on the moment of hope, which I think was given to the Kosovars, that finally, a new government that is committed to rule of law, anti-corruption, and economic growth is in place, and to see what you can do to kind of keep that optimism and keep people from leaving.
Absolutely. And on a last note, in Serbia, what do you expect from the Serbian elections?
Probably not many surprises. I mean, Vučić seems to have a very good, very good grip on election strategies that we know
Media
from the
and so
Western
forth.
Balkans,
Yeah.
media, using public employment as a
So Serbia is much more predictable politically than Kosovo has been in recent election cycle.
I think so. I think what you hear from most of the analysts, that the state of the opposition in Serbia is such that no one is hopeful for change, at least not in the short term.
Majda, on that note, many other issues we could cover if we had time, but I only have a limited space. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And safe travels to Berlin. I may see you in the Senate again one of these days.
Lovely, I hope so.
On that note, we'll take a break. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at VOA and RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshin.